What if I told you that some of the most Christian spaces in medieval Spain, monasteries, cathedrals, and royal tombs, were designed using architectural forms and artistic styles borrowed from Islamic art? This is one of the questions that fascinated me most while I did my medieval studies in Spain. So let's uncover this answer. Why did these Christian guys admire Muslims so much in art and architecture? We often think of cultures as isolated, self-contained entities. Christian, Muslim, Jewish. But the reality of medieval Iberia defies those categories. The architecture, art, and visual culture of the peninsula was shaped by centuries of borrowing, reworking, and reimagining across religious lines. Nothing came from scratch. Muslims in Al-Andalus built on Roman, Visigothic, and Byzantine forms. Christians, in turn, drew from both Islamic and classical precedents. The result was a shared visual image, sometimes intentional, sometimes unconscious, that defined the look and feel of medieval Spain. During the so-called Reconquista, Christian nobles often became the greatest admirers of Islamic aesthetics. Many of these elites were the primary donors to monasteries and churches, and their patronage helped shape sacred spaces that were deeply influenced by the styles of their Muslim neighbors and rivals. Monasteries like Las Huelgas and Burgos are filled with architecture that would not have existed without the influence of Al-Andalus. These weren't seen as foreign or subversive, they were simply prestigious, elegant, royal, part of the high visual culture of the time. But did these Christian patrons actually think of these forms as Islamic? Maybe so, but probably not in a deep sense. It's unlikely that a noble commissioning of a tomb in the 13th century would have seen the use of a mudéjar arch as anything other than a stylish or noble choice. It was obvious to them that this was the best style to choose for their own architecture to display their power. These forms had been fully integrated into a Castilian identity, taken directly from Al-Andalus to the south. So at what point does something be an adaptation or something borrowed? And at what point does something become a part of somebody's own identity? It's an interesting question to ponder. These weren't necessarily about religious dialogue or tolerance, but neither were they expressions of purity. It was just a part of the visual world at the time. In fact, a tomb at Las Huelgas depicts scenes of the crucifixion, with mosque domes rising in the background, not as threats or critiques, but simply as a part of the landscape. You can see the crests and moons here. Christian nobles wore robes and silks that mirrored Muslim fashion. There was no contradiction in this. It was just life in medieval Spain. And when I visited Las Huelgas for the first time, this blew my mind. I had thought these cultures were completely opposed to one another, but here they were, dressing like each other and wanting to be buried in the style that they thought was most elegant. So today, people continue to talk about origins in popular media. Was this form originally Islamic? Was that building really Christian? These questions come from a modern obsession with purity and authenticity that medieval people themselves did not seem to share. It wasn't until after the early modern period, after the conquest of Granada, after the expulsions, under the weight of the Inquisition, that Spain became concerned with purification. In that climate, cultural forms began to be policed. Suddenly, this style called mudéjar looked very suspicious. Mosques and synagogues were erased or converted on massive scale, and visual traces of shared history became liabilities. But if we return to earlier centuries, from the 9th to 15th, we find something far more fluid. Christians and Muslims lived in overlapping visual worlds. We see styles like used from the Almohads in Christian, Muslim, and Jewish buildings. I think of Santa Maria la Blanca in Toledo, or the Capilla de la Asunción in Las Huelgas, which use Almohad style. These were three different religions, but they used the same exact patterns, the same materials. They shaped a world together, even though these groups were politically opposed or religiously opposed. And that's the key. Cultural forms don't carry fixed meanings. They shift with context. What looks Castilian to one generation might look Islamic to the next. Art doesn't obey categories. What medieval Iberia teaches us is that identity is always in motion. Beauty crosses boundaries, and history is not made by purity, but by contact, conflict, admiration, and reuse. Please subscribe to my channel if you enjoyed this content.